So let's start. It's a real pleasure to be hosting this discussion with such an amazing panel of international experts. We'll be talking about how to navigate the complexities of carbon finance in clean cooking today. Clean cooking and carbon finance is a topic that's pretty close to my heart for those who know me. My involvement in clean cooking projects started back in 2005 during a trip to Cambodia. I feel old when I say that. And more formally in 2009 when I actually moved there and started working with the team on the ground. And at the time, so 15 years ago, we were already discussing some of the issues we are going to discuss today. How do you prevent survey bias? How do you prevent or measure accurately stacking? What's the right number for the fraction of non-renewable biomass? So there's been a lot of progress in the last 15 years. We now have a global definition for clean stoves. We have national and international standards for how to measure the performance of stoves. The Clean Cooking Alliance was founded during this time, I think 10 years ago. We also have an indicator for clean cooking that was built into the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's universal access to clean cooking by 2030. So we all know that clean cooking has a pivotal role to play in combating global health and environmental challenges, but we're not there yet. The journey to universal clean cooking access by 2030 faces a number of key challenges, and those challenges, unfortunately, continue to impede progress. Today, in April 2024, the sector is at a crossroads. It's facing a really high level of scrutiny and debates over the effectiveness of carbon finance mechanisms. So we'll talk about all of that during this webinar today. Before we dive in, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our sixth panelist, Molly Brown, Head of Carbon Strategy at Burn. Welcome, Molly. It's a pleasure to have you today. Elisa Derby, Senior Director, Climate Impacts and Standards at the Clean Cooking Alliance. Welcome, Elisa. Gaj Hedje, Team Lead Regulatory Development at the UNFCCC Secretariat. Welcome, Gaj. Nick Marshall, Director of the Project Developer Forum and co-founder and director at Task. Welcome, Nick. Thomas Schroeder, Head of Environmental Products at EDF Trading. Welcome, Tom. And last but not least, Annelise Marie-Ville, graduate student researcher and a PhD candidate in the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, and author of Pervasive Overcrediting from Cookstove Offset Methodologies. Welcome, Annelise. So our conversation today will be divided in three sections. We'll start by discussing the state of the clean cooking sector and the role carbon credits play in it. Then we will dive into the challenges the sector is facing. And finally, our third and final part will be focused on discussing solutions and a way forward for the sector. So to kick us off, let's look at the sector in general and the role that carbon credits play to reach universal access to clean cooking by 2030. Research indicates that 2.3 billion people lack access to clean, fuel-efficient cooking. 2.3 billion people. The numbers are staggering. The International Energy Agency estimates that we need about $8 billion a year, but only 1% of total energy spend is going to clean cooking measures. So obviously there's a significant funding gap and the stakes are extremely high. Starting with you, Elisa, as I was just saying, the numbers are really staggering. 2.3 billion people still without access to modern energy cooking services, such a simple daily task. What role does the Clean Cooking Alliance play in facilitating this transition?
Thank you so much, Marianne, and to the whole Sustain team for organizing this. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today. So yeah, you're right. The numbers are staggering. And as you mentioned, in addition to the direct human impact on families, the lack of access to clean cooking is responsible for a number of other impacts. We know a gigaton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions each year, more than half of all man-made black carbon emissions, and 16% of ambient air pollution, because smoke generated in the home doesn't just stay in the home. So CCA works with a global network of partners to bring clean cooking to the billions without it. We're working to build a dynamic, inclusive, and financially sustainable industry. And as you already touched on, our biggest challenge is that clean cooking remains dramatically underfunded. As you said, less than 1% of the funding needed. Now, we know that global climate goals can't be achieved without clean cooking, thanks to IPCC. And we know that the carbon market could provide the funding necessary to rapidly expand clean cooking access. So clean cooking and carbon finance are a fantastic pairing, and we're glad to focus on that today.
Amazing. So let's double click on carbon finance, Elisa, because it's a very peculiar financing mechanism. And you were saying there's a huge funding gap, so we need carbon finance to help close some of that gap. Why is carbon finance the right instrument in your view, as opposed to more traditional donor finance or private finance? Why is it suited for this sector?
Well, excitingly, there are several reasons. So first, let's talk about the fact that clean cooking is not primarily a profit-driven endeavor. So we've struggled with some of the more traditional financing. Now, the dividends are huge, let's be honest, but they come in the form of societal and environmental benefits, and sometimes health benefits, which can save governments tremendous amount of money, but aren't going to line anyone's pockets. And the customer base is largely low income with limited access to credit. So traditional finance is harder to attract. But carbon finance is a great match for a number of reasons. Done well, it incentivizes higher quality products and all of the best practices to drive increased access and actual usage, including because of the measurement, reporting, and verification requirements that are not always present with other kinds of finance. So if people stop using the stove, the revenues go away. That's a great impetus to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your clients and ensuring that they remain happy with them and keep using the products. Carbon finance also incentivizes doing projects in places where these kinds of activities can have the biggest climate impact. Now, that doesn't mean that families in other parts of the world don't also deserve clean cooking access, but we have an opportunity to really hone in with carbon finance on those areas where there's the biggest climate impact and use other forms of support for clean cooking activities in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Elisa. That's really interesting. So you reflected on the fact that it's a sector that's really struggling to access traditional finance because of the nature of the sector. And on the other hand, carbon finance creates incentive for clean cooking projects to perform highly, to ensure high usage rates, high efficiency of stoves. There's a virtuous circle there. Exactly. What's your perspective? Yeah, thanks. And so building on that, Molly, what's your perspective? So we heard the theory from Elisa. Burn is a company that designs, produces, and commercializes cooking devices. You're one of the largest carbon offset project developer, probably in the clean cooking sector. Burn recently closed a funding round. It's not easy to raise money in this market environment and in this sector. So congratulations to you and the team at Burn. What's your take on the role of carbon finance, and do the arguments that Elisa just listed resonate with you? What role does carbon finance play in your business model?
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks SustainCert for having us. As you mentioned, I work for Burn, and we are very proud to make extremely high quality, highly engineered stoves across the full product suite. So we do the world's best biomass cook stoves. We also do electric stoves now, as well as LPG. The problem is that we make really good stoves that are quite expensive, and we try and distribute them to people who have very little money. And what we've found in the last few years is that carbon finance is really the only viable funding mechanism to scale clean cooking quickly enough and on a scale that's required to meet the demand. As you mentioned, there's 2.5 billion people cooking with wood and charcoal every day. So at Burn, we use carbon investment to offer subsidies of up to $40 per stove. So we can now distribute our wood stoves in rural areas for only $3 to $5 for very low income families. And we can also use this carbon subsidy to make our electric cooking affordable. And we're now distributing high quality induction stoves with cookware across 6 countries in Africa. Now, we're aware that there have previously been other kind of funding mechanisms, as you mentioned, but to give you a sense of the scale, before carbon, we were reaching thousands of homes each year. And since carbon funding has really come online, in the last 3 years, we've scaled to 10 countries across Africa, and we've delivered $67 million of clean cooking subsidies for millions of homes. So the sense of scale with carbon is just much bigger. And given the kind of urgency, I guess, of the clean cooking crisis, we think carbon funding is really crucial to get clean cook stoves to the billions of people who need them.
Thanks, Molly, for sharing those numbers. It's a really strong source of hope to see that a company like Burn could scale that fast over the last 3 years through carbon finance. Thanks for sharing your experience with us. Thomas, looking at the buy-side perspective, why, as a carbon credit buyer representing EDF Trading, why choose carbon credit from cook stove over other project types? What's the interest from a buyer perspective in supporting this sector?
Thanks for the question, Marion, and thanks for inviting me. Yes, I represent EDF Trading, of course, generally a company active in the power and gas sector, but I'm happy to lead the environmental products team. And as such, we are working in the voluntary carbon space. I have been in this space now for over a decade. And I think to your question, what's really important is to pursue an all of the above approach when you are a provider and you really need to offer, I guess, a smorgasbord of different carbon credit types, catering to different tastes. So the portfolio needs to be balanced and you pursue a diversified strategy, including both avoidance and removal credits. And what's so special about the cookstove projects is their community angle. So in addition, of course, to slowing or halting deforestation in certain areas, it leads to very clear health benefits, leads to local job creation. And that is something that resonates very well with some buyers, because buyers always try to establish an alignment with the values that they pursue, or to establish some sort of emotional rapport. And that generally works quite well, for example, when it comes to anything that has to do with tree projects, because everybody gets a tree. And with cook stove projects, that community angle is also something that's quite fascinating. In a previous role, for example, we worked with the NBA in the US, where you have a lot of African-American players, and they really liked the community angle of supporting villagers in Africa. So something like that then really works well from a storytelling perspective. And of course, it also has this global transition angle that can be pushed, and that has something to do also with climate justice, that you help communities that are actually less affluent and more disaffected to also transition.
Thanks, Thomas. And it's really sort of echoing what we heard from Elisa, that these are multi-benefits projects that go sort of far beyond carbon impacts, looking at health, communities, forest protection as well, and that resonates a lot with the demand side. So moving into some of the controversy or some of the challenges that the sector is facing, there has been significant turmoil since the publication earlier this year, as you will all know, in January, of the paper Pervasive Overcrediting from Cook Stove Offset Methodologies by Annelies and her co-authors. Annelies is facing technical issues. She isn't able to join the webinar yet, or just now, I think. Maybe we'll see if that works. But we're working on it. Hey, Annelies, we were just coming to you. Welcome. Was super happy to see that you could make it. Teams sometimes is surprising you with technical issues. I was just introducing your paper and saying that this has really accelerated the discussion around cookstove projects since its publication and even before it was published. People close to this space know that the challenges that are discussed in the paper are not new, right? But clearly it drew attention from the wider public, including the media and carbon offset buyers who might not have been aware of these issues before. So I'd love to talk about that in more details and understand how the market is addressing those challenging and how the market has been working on addressing those challenges over the years. So starting with you, Annelies, and focusing on the key highly controversial finding, I must say, of your paper that clean cooking projects overissue carbon credits by close to 10x. I think the exact number is 9.2 times. This has been contested by main market standards and a range of players. Can you walk us through at a high level how you reached that conclusion, Annelies? And you're on mute. Yes.
Hi. Okay, good.
Good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. I just want to start by saying that I know I'm a couple minutes late, but there's so much common ground on this panel. I've spent years working on cookstove projects and even wrote the paper while living in Tanzania working on LPG. And so I know firsthand how important cookstove projects are to the health and the lives of people globally. But we also know that they're too important to have the financing structure be shaky, right? So this initially started as an effort to vet quality projects for the whole 10 campus UC system, but we conducted the first comprehensive over and under crediting analysis of 5 major cookstove offset methodologies by assessing all factors that go into the estimation of the emission reductions. It passed rigorous peer review and was published in Nature Sustainability, a top journal, as you mentioned, in January. So we compared the 5 major cookstove offset methodologies with published literature by factor, and we found misalignment with the fraction of non-renewable biomass, the firewood charcoal conversion factor, stove adoption, usage, and stacking rate. So that's the use of multiple stoves in parallel, as well as fuel consumption, rebound, and emission factors. So how did we do it? We drew on a sample of 51 projects that spanned 8 methodology stove combinations. So there are a lot of tough acronyms for the offset methodology, different types. So there's GSTPDD tech, which looks very different if it's an LPG project or a improved firewood stove. So we split it up by methodology stove combination. Our sample spanned 25 countries, and it represented 40% of the market, but through the POA VPA structure, it could tangentially be 68%. So we compared the emission reductions claimed by the projects and allowed by the standards, of course, or the methodologies, compared to our analysis based on the current state of science. And then we weighted the average amount of overcrediting by project, breaking it down by methodology stove combination, accounting for all factors to get to that 10. So that 10 times overcredited takes into account all the interactions from different factors. So for instance, from FNRB, it might contribute 2 times, adoption might contribute some more, emission factors might actually be a source of undercrediting. So all the interactions is how we got to the 9, and then if we weight by those the number of issued credits, we got to 10. But I actually think the most important finding and contribution of the work is not the 10 times. It's that we highlight GS metered fuel switching projects as the methodology that was the least overcredited and the best suited to deploy stoves that meet the health benefits according to the World Health Organization, right? And finally, we present a way forward for buyers and also project developers to have trust and confidence in the quality of cookstove offsets today. So we have recommendations for the methodologies, but we also provide recommendations for project developers to implement literally right now in order for buyers to have trust in the quality of these really important cookstove projects.
Thanks, Annelise, for detailing your methodological approach and also for amplifying the recommendations that you've produced. And we'll talk about the solutions and what has happened and is happening in the sector to solve those issues. Turning to you, Nick, you're representing the Project Developer Forum, which has issued a response to the paper. I think it came out yesterday, so very timely, challenging the conclusion and some of the methodological choices taken by the authors. Can you elaborate maybe on the two main disagreements? I think that you identified one relating to the methodology and the other one, I think, was focused on the fraction of non-renewable biomass. What are your concerns, Nick, with the choices made there?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Marianne, and thanks to the SustainCert team for inviting me on. I'm a director of TASK, which is a cookstove project developer, but also a director of the Project Developer Forum, which is a grouping of carbon project developers, many of whom develop cookstove carbon projects. And to my knowledge, this is the first time we've actually been invited into this debate, right? Which is one of our biggest concerns in all of this, is that we haven't really had a right to reply so far. So, and unfortunately, the publication of the report has, of course, led to the media focusing on the 10 times overcrediting, which is the aspect that has left a lot of us as project developers scratching our heads to wondering why we've got it so wrong and why we're dramatically overstating our impact. And so that obviously led us to do a little bit of analysis as to the paper itself. And the 2 points that you guys have asked me to address are amongst many. And I would encourage everyone to have a look at the rebuttal paper that the Project Developer Forum has published yesterday, which covers a range of aspects. And you can find it on LinkedIn, or you can contact me and I'll point you in the right direction. But one of them, as you rightly say, is on the methodology, is the way that the paper compares carbon projects with, in fact, non-carbon projects. And that is not a like-for-like comparison. We've, you know, Elisa actually took a lot of the words out of my mouth about what the carbon market means for cookstove carbon projects, which is that it's a step change in terms of scaling, in terms of the professionalism and the way that projects are implemented. It's and the study kind of neglects to address those improvements that are addressed in the carbon market, that are inherent in the carbon market, around methodologies, around the technology improvements that Molly's talked about, around operations, the logistics of actually getting cookstoves into remote communities, around monitoring, reporting and verification, the transparency of data. It's all there. And to compare that with a project that was undertaken, say, 15 years ago, that didn't have the inherent incentives that the carbon market, of course, has, is not a like-for-like comparison. It's not a fair comparison to make. And to use a very specific example on usage rates, you know, there are huge incentives for project developers in carbon projects to actually encourage the usage of the stoves. If the stoves don't get used, you don't get paid. It's as simple as that. And so there's every incentive for project developers to work with communities, to work with householders, to encourage the adoption rates of stove. And that is a hugely important aspect in carbon projects. The second aspect, and this is a rather that is not, sorry, I just want to say that is not an aspect of overcrediting, right? So that stoves get used more in carbon projects is not overcrediting of emissions. It's performance related. The second aspect was FNRB, fraction of non-renewable biomass, which is of course a very complex area and difficult for me to cover in a very short space of time. But safe to say that it is not a done deal, right? So there is a UNFCCC consultation that took place earlier this year. There is a focus or there should at least be a focus on accuracy in this debate rather than conservativeness, right? So it's another criticism of the paper is that it over relies on conservativeness as opposed to accuracy. When you're developing these sort of parameter values, what is crucial is to have the most accurate data that you can possibly present. And in that regard, the Project Development Forum again has undertaken an initiative to gather together validated baseline household wood use data and charcoal use data that comes from registered carbon projects to feed into that parameter value. And what we have found is that in most cases, certainly from TASK's perspective, that households use about double the amount of fuel than is suggested by the modelers of the default values that the paper uses. And that is one of the sources of overcrediting that is found, but it's not necessarily an accurate picture of what is happening in the field. And so that is also, from our perspective, not proven as a case of overcrediting. So just to sum up very briefly, is if you took every single worst case scenario in a carbon project and compared it to a non-carbon project, you might get to somewhere near to the 10 times of overcrediting, but it simply is not a fair comparison. It is not a like-for-like comparison, and it neglects the improvements and the performance that is inherent in carbon projects. And that's pretty much our position.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for sharing your perspective and the arguments put forward by the Project Developer Forum. For our audience, we will share, and I think the link from the Project Developer Forum response was posted in the chat. And it is your paper, I think, is available online behind paywall. So we'll talk about the FNRB issue in a minute. First, Annelise, focusing on the methodological issue that Nick mentioned, the fact that carbon finance changes fundamentally the performance of cooking projects because it's a performance-based financing instrument. Can you explain your choice to compare carbon projects with non-carbon projects?
Yeah, and thank you, Nick. We welcome the criticism and really appreciate the engagement. So first, I just want to say to clarify, so we only replace the adoption, usage, and stacking values for methodologies that rely on only survey-based and surveys that, unfortunately, although there have been improvements, still have substantial limitations. They're infrequent, they're simple, they're carried out by the projects themselves. Like, did you use the stove last month? One question type surveys that don't protect against social desirability bias or recall bias. So these limitations are particularly stark compared to research studies that use multiple robust methods to construct their adoption, usage, and stacking rates. But of course, we can't go back in time. I wish we could. We could also do some fun stuff with additionality if we could, but we can't go back in time. And so we were using these robust studies that are using rigorous surveys, conducting KPTs, metering the stoves. We use them as the best available evidence since we can't go back, right? And we definitely admit that there are differences and write extensively in the paper's supplemental materials, which I know isn't always the most exciting part to read, but we write extensively about this difference between research studies and offset projects. So yes, results-based financing should motivate developers to structure projects so that households adopt and use the stoves at higher rates. However, that obtaining those high rates of adoption and usage is difficult, as the literature has shown, right? Like, frankly, if the rates of adoption of improved and clean cook stoves were as high as some of these projects are claiming, we might, as a clean cooking researcher, I would, in a great way, not have a long career, So it's difficult to obtain high rates of adoption and usage, and the incentive to create projects that households like the stove and like to use it is blurred with the incentive to report high usage and adoption rates. So we are able to establish that the cook stove offset projects are sufficiently similar to the projects covered in the research studies because many projects in the literature work with similar NGOs, similar to the ones that offset projects are working with. We did an in-depth analysis comparing the contexts and scopes of projects in our sample compared to the research studies. The studies span rural and urban settings across a wide range of countries and program types. Even some of them are actually, offset projects that research was involved in. So we did an in-depth analysis comparing even the baselines of studies to make sure those were comparable. They span different financing structures. So some of the studies, just like offset projects, give out stoves for free, while others have some sort of subsidy rate. The majority of countries, project sizes, broad stove categories are all represented in these ranges that we construct. And further, the barriers from reviews not conducted by us, ours was not a comprehensive review, but the systematic reviews in the literature have shown that the barriers to improved and clean stove adoption and usage and the reasons for persistent stacking have identified their universal barriers, right? So further, the research studies actually represent likely the upper bound of adoption and usage, given the amount of involvement from the research team. So that's something that's often criticized of research, is that the more you visit, the more they use the stove, right? So that is kind of our full justification, and lots of citations and further details going in depth to each study and offset project is in our supplemental. For really quickly, I know we're going to get to FNRB, but just for a rebuttal on that point. So the peer review process, especially for an outlet like Nature Sustainability, is long and time consuming, and they don't let you update your values like the day before publication, right? And so we released a preprint in early 2022, and that's when we submitted initially to Nature, right? So that's a long process. And so when we submitted, we relied on the wisdom values from Bayless et al., which compared to Tool 30's FNRB, it's accounting for ecological change, land heterogeneity, like there are limitations in those values. I'm not denying that, but we were drawing on the best available robust evidence based on over 20 years of research from multiple authors. And so we were using the best available values. And then, of course, the new MOFIS, which we highly support that research, those values were released after we had submitted the final draft to Nature Sustainability. However, in the paper, we advocate kind of, knowing that those values were coming, saying those are the values that we would suggest projects use in the future. And of course, we want to support using the current state of science as it evolves. And if you look at the majority of those MOFIS values, they're actually lower in most cases than the wisdom values we used. So in that sense, our estimate is probably, if we were to do it again with the new MOFIS values that just came out and we commented on in support of, it would probably, that 10 times is actually underestimating the amount.
Thanks, Annelise, for this thorough sort of response. And so if I summarize the two sort of big controversies that emerge, one are around comparing carbon projects with non-carbon projects, and you responded to that in great details. And then the second sort of controversy is around the fraction of non-renewable biomass. You started addressing it, Annelise. It's a very important parameter in the cook stove emission reduction calculation. Gaj, you lead the methodology team at the UNFCCC. Can you help us unpack this issue of fraction of non-renewable biomass for our audience who may not be completely familiar with the concept? Can you say a few words about what this means? And what are some of the solutions or approaches that the UNFCCC is proposing there?
Thank you, Marianne. And first of all, thanks for Sustainsa to involve in this webinar. Yeah, as regards FNRB, indeed, it's a very important parameter. In fact, it enabled cook stove projects under carbon markets. To understand its significance, we have to go back to 2006 or 2007, when there was a decision under Kyoto Protocol that you can account for carbon pool changes only in afforestation and reforestation projects. So before that decision, which was probably around 2007, there were few bookstore projects. One of them became famous under Nepal biogas projects. They were using directly the carbon content in the wood to do the estimation. But following this decision from the CMP, there was a gap that there was no methodology available with which the bookstore projects could qualify. But there was a desire from the highest body of CMP. In fact, it was repeated 2 times, a request that was made to CDM Executive Board to develop such a methodology for many of the reasons many panelists, Elisa mentioned, you mentioned, and others, because of the many co-benefits. So it took 2 years for the CDM board to develop such a methodology. And then the compromise there was this concept of FNRB, fraction of non-renewable biomass. At a high level, it tries to capture the fact that if you harvest the wood beyond the rate at which the sustainably it can produce the normal growth rates of the forest or wherever the excess is taking place, then progressively you are reducing the forest cover, and which is somewhat comparable to what happens if you use fossil fuel, if not exactly the same, but that's at the high level concept. And so that was introduced, and that allowed the methodology to come into play. And then, but nevertheless, there was not much uptake in the early years because these projects are complex. You need to distribute a lot of units and then monitor in very diverse locations. But later on, with programmatic approaches and the other simplifications, many of these projects started rolling out. And there are many benefits of this kind of projects compared to the alternatives. But coming back to the FNRB issue, initially it was thought that it was a high number because most projects were reporting those high numbers. But only after the first publication by the team from Rob Bylis and others in Nature, it was around 2015. That study shed more light on what this could be after 5 years of research work. And then that showed that in comparison to what projects were reporting until at that time, it was typically 0.8 or 0.9. Was being used, and then if that was true, then in many locations there should not be much of the forest would be left in the region. But that study put a new light into this issue, and then the average number according to that time or that study was around 0.3. So this was reflected in the methodologies in CDM around that time. It was 2016 or so, and it was left to the market to look at this number and then report numbers based on the local data. But in fact, some of the recent work we did and also others have done, the estimations are still on the higher side. I will not go into all the details, but because of which the CDM board revisited the issue. And then it asked the experts to update that study, which was done in 2015 with the latest information, and at least come to numbers which are sort of more regionally appropriate. So that's the public consultation, which Nick also mentioned. And so the initial work has been put into the public. It's essentially, as compared to the past, in the past, there was a more high-level approach to look at the total supply of wood and total generation of wood, and then come to some sort of number. And it generalized many things for simplification. But this effort, this is leading to more accurate or more scientifically based information. And it's up for public consultation. It's not yet done. And we have received up to 55 comments, which is being processed.
Yeah. Good. Thanks, Gaj. I'd like to make sure we have time to talk about the solutions. What I really appreciated in your answer, Gaj, is that it gives a really strong view on the continuous improvement process that has been going on since early 2005, 2006. It also speaks to the fact that FNRB is a highly complex scientific issue, and that's why the market and project developers and standards, everyone is struggling with it. I was doing some research in preparation for that webinar, and there are some countries where you find FNRB values from highly reliable sources like FAO or others that range from 19% to maybe 80%. So which value do you choose? It's really difficult to navigate. So we'll talk about the solutions in a minute. Before we go there, I wanted to hear from you, Molly, as a project developer, highly active in that space. What has been the impact of the recent discussions and on the paper, if any, on your activities, both positive and negative impacts? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because while we agree with many of the points in the paper, none of this is new, right? Like as Gaj has outlined, the UN's been thinking about these points for a very long time. Alyssa from CCA is leading the work around developing the new 4Cs methodology. Like these issues are things that quality cookstove developers have been thinking about for a really long time. And I think one of the concerns we have with the paper is that what it really does is it uses quite old literature and compares it, old literature of non-carbon projects, and compares it to contemporary carbon projects. So what we see is, for example, the paper uses 9 studies, half of which are over 10 years old, all of which are of non-cookstove carbon projects, to adjust the adoption rate down to 58% for the whole industry. While we understand the kind of academic framework for doing that, we're not totally sure why a big RCT in India from 2005, which is looking at the adoption of very basic stoves, is relevant to contemporary, high integrity, carbon funded, stainless steel, durable stoves that we know last in the field. And the most, I guess, interesting comparison for us there is Bern actually is lucky to have a recent randomized control trial of 1,000 households in Nairobi, and that actually finds a sustained adoption rate of 86% 3 years after the stoves were distributed. So we find the kind of adjusting the entire industry down, constraining it to a maximum value of 58%. We find that jarring, and obviously that is one of the things that drives the headline overcrediting figure. And one of the issues, I suppose, with having a big overcrediting figure as the headline is that drives the media coverage. And to your point, Marion, what we've seen since the first kind of pre-print of this paper was circulated widely about a year ago is that there has been a negative impact on the sector. The positive thing, I suppose, is that there are still buyers, many of them in the sector, and they're all interested in quality. So one of the good, I suppose, outcomes of the paper is a drive to quality projects, and particularly a drive to projects which have academic research like Bern does that can validate their impact, can validate their usage, their adoption, and their emission factors.
Great.
Emission reductions.
Thanks,
sorry.
Molly. Thanks for that. Annelies, do you want to quickly respond to Molly's point, and then we turn into solution? Very, very brief response from you, Annelies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you actually for the opportunity. Oh, do I have feedback? Am I okay? Sorry, on my end I did, so I don't want 200 people to hear that. Absolutely, and actually a lot of Bern's projects are GSTPDD tax, so then that value wouldn't actually even be applied to your projects, Molly, since we take a slightly different approach for kitchen performance tests, so that for GSTPDD tax, but also I wanted to say that our paper assessed the market, and so there are a ton of issued credits, dating back. It's not as if we're only applying credits issued in 2022. In fact, we didn't do that because this research started in 2020, 2021, so it's a long process. So yes, we're applying older studies, but also we're applying that to older projects, right? We're looking at all the issued credits on the market, and we talk about that. And we are super excited to see things changing as these new projects, frankly, from Sustain Cert, it's incredible to see the difference of when I'm, was on Sustain Cert on the project's websites, in 2020 and 2021 to what they're like now, like Excel files, all these monitoring, like it's wonderful, the publicly available information and the scale. I will also say that, you know, we've talked with Dr. Berkauer, and you know, it wasn't an intentional snub. We just had her paper wasn't published by the time we were doing the review.
Thanks.
And yeah.
Thanks, Annelise. Yeah. Amazing. We could spend the entire discussion on that, but I wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to respond. From where I'm standing, clearly a positive consequence of the paper is that we're having this conversation, that the momentum for change is accelerating, and we shouldn't underestimate that it's also creating challenges for those in this space. I understand, talking to Nick, Molly, that the demand and sales have been drying up. Thomas, let's talk about the demand side. And I think we had in the chat a question on prices for cookstove projects, so feel free to cover that as well. You represent EDF Trading, which is a buyer with a long-standing commitment to the clean cooking sector. What's your take on the recent study? And has this changed in any way the way you do your due diligence on clean cooking projects before buying offsets?
Yeah, so generally, I have to say, I mean, I've done a PhD myself. I really welcome scientific debate, and it's super important that we drive this sector forward. I think all of us who've been in this space for a while, we joined because we wanted to create climate impact and drive action. And ultimately, I think it's important that we don't lose sight of this a grand goal. We need to really improve the methods, but at the same time they're already being used, right? So it's kind of a case of flying a plane that you're still building in a way. So and that's the same across all methodologies. Like I say, I mean, we also of course dabble in nature-based removals and avoidance and RED Plus and what's happening there, and it's just all across the board, this debate, and it's important to have it, but it should be done, I think, in a constructive manner that makes it possible for actors who want to deploy resources into this because they believe in it, not to be kind of denigrated for it. So generally, these papers certainly had an effect on demand, but we've already heard it really from Molly before. What's really happened is that we see more and more a flight towards quality and a stratification really of pricing. There are a lot of informed buyers. There's also new buyers, of course, coming into the market, and they are taking more advice than they did before. I mean, also us really as a provider, a trading house, we have ratcheted up our internal due diligence processes. I mean, we relied to some extent on ratings agencies, but really the most of what we do is internal research. So we hired a portfolio specialist who is also a cook stove project specialist, so who's been on the ground in Africa himself, and we have really worked on very elaborate questionnaires, and then of course site visits. So we make sure that anything that we sell really is up to scratch, that we can really stand behind it, because ultimately the EDF brand then is at stake here as well. So I mean, just like the developers who have a reputation to lose, so do we. In terms of prices, I mean, I have to say that they have remained relatively stable. What's really happened is more that demand ebbed off, but that hasn't really led to a kind of slippage in terms of price. They are then again depending, of course, on vintage and geography and documented co-benefits and this kind of laddering of quality criteria. There are different elements that contribute then to price finding and price discovery. And then, of course, there's this whole element now which we see around LOAs and Article 6. And of course, cook stoves are kind of the first cab of the rank, really, in terms of methods. So we see at the moment quite some supply coming online, really, of these projects. And the jury's still out how much of a price premium there will be attributed to these well, ultimately corresponding adjustments. But yeah, so on the pricing side, it's been relatively stable. And fortunately now over the last few weeks, I can also say that demand has somewhat re-emerged, and yeah, that we do go out with some quotes for this project type as well.
That's a great news to know that demand is coming back, and also the news on stratification. I think that's what we want, right? And EDF being an informed buyer, you're doing your own due diligence, and we assume that many other buyers do the same. So looking forward at the solutions, going back to you, Elisa, I know the Alliance is working on a range of solutions to rebuild trust and continuously strengthen credibility. It's not new. It started 10 years ago, I think, when the Alliance was
14.
founded. 14, wow. So what are the key solutions we should watch out in the next few weeks and few months if we're interested in following this space? What's happening?
Yeah, great. I'll mention a few and invite folks to follow up afterwards if they want more detail. But yes, we are in eat, sleep, breathe carbon integrity mode at CCA right now. So I should mention we do much of our technical climate work through the Clean Cooking and Climate Consortium, or 4C, which Molly referenced. And that includes CCA, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the UNFCCC Secretariat. Gaj is a founding member, for example. Berkeley Air Monitoring Group, Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Clean Air and Climate Coalition. So our biggest focus right now is on the development of the methodology that Molly referenced, and I also saw a Q&A reference to it. So I'm excited that that's being discussed. So this is the first ever carbon methodology designed to cover all cooking transition scenarios. So metered and non-metered fuels. We won't need multiple methodologies for clean cooking carbon projects. So this hopefully will become the standard for all cooking projects under Article 6.2, Article 6.4, the voluntary carbon market, and incorporates it incorporates the latest science on all of the key parameters that Annalise highlighted. It will generate the most realistic reductions to date, reduce integrity risks, incentivize best practices, increase consistency across standard bodies. So we're really excited about it. And that will come out for public comment in the next couple of months. So stay tuned on that. We're in parallel developing an online carbon data platform to make free, accurate, and standardized cookstove carbon project data input available to project developers and anyone. So to reduce costs for carbon finance and again, foster consistency and integrity. We're also starting to work with cookstove carbon credit buyers, both on the corporate side and buyer countries, as well as ratings agencies and others to provide due diligence support and improve the evaluation of clean cooking carbon projects. And to Tom's point, we are seeing a huge increase in questions from interested buyers who want really high quality projects and are willing to pay $20 to $40 a ton for them. We need to get away from this $4 to $7 a ton. You can't do a good project if that's what you're getting paid for it. So we're excited about that change we're seeing. Let's, look forward to that actually being signed off on across the board. And then finally, as many have probably heard, CCA has been leading the development of principles for responsible carbon finance and clean cooking. We currently have interim principles and will very soon have the full principles and a code of conduct. So please stay tuned on that too. And I will share links to all of our information where you can read more about any of that.
Thanks, Elisa. It's heartening to hear about everything that's happening and all the multi-stakeholder work going on to drive credibility and integrity. To close on a high note, I'd like to turn back to you, Molly. Bern is one of the first project developers to use the new methodology from Gold Standard for metered stove. At SustainSet, we're convinced that technology digitization are a big part of the solution. Can you tell us very briefly how tech in this specific context can help solve those challenges?
Yeah, so we're really excited. We just, our POA for electric cooking is now live, and we're in the process of listing VPAs for the electric projects that we have across 6 African countries. So we're distributing industry-leading induction stoves with stainless steel cookware that we manufacture ourselves in Kenya, and each stove has an Internet of Things sensor inside and a SIM card, which means we can track the live usage rate of each stove. So if someone's cooking breakfast, we can see how many kilowatt hours they use. That enables us to offer pay-as-you-cook financing to reduce the cost of the stove even further. It also allows us to do digital monitoring through the gold standard methodology and have a closer feedback loop with customers. So if someone stops cooking for a couple of days, we can check in on them and see what's going on. So we're very excited about electric stoves, but let's not forget about the important role that high quality improved biomass projects can play. There's 1 billion people in Africa cooking with wood and charcoal today. Burn's done 4 million stoves, which is a lot, but that still means there's about 200 million households left who still need clean cook stoves. Now, best practice monitoring for biomass will look different. Annalise rightly calls out kitchen performance tests as the most robust methodology so far. But we're doing more and more experiments in digital monitoring for biomass stoves. We've got lots of tests going on in the field. It's a bit more difficult and it will take some time to get that right. But we're confident we'll get there because we have the very best engineers on the case. The only point will be that there will need to be a premium price because sensors are expensive. So the market needs to be sensitive that if they're getting much more expensive monitoring through digitization, that there will need to be a different price. But we're almost there with the biomass stoves as well as the electric stoves. So watch this space.
Thanks, Molly, and thank you so much for your insights. Annelise, Elisa, Nick, Gage, Tom, I really appreciated the constructive dialogue. We're reaching the end of our webinar. There's been a lot of engagement in the chat function as well, lots of comments, contributions and questions as well. The issues are well known, they're complex, they're not new. Scientific studies and media scrutiny, as painful as they may be, are forcing an acceleration of the changes needed to overcome those challenges. It was great to hear that going forward, we can expect a lot more convergence and consistency in the way carbon market standards and carbon project approach those challenges. And it's expected, we all hope this is going to drive a race to the top, right? Where quality and prices go up hand in hand. That's what we all want. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. Thank you to our audience, close to 200 people watching us, and keep watching this space. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.